On January 1st, 2024, Mickey Mouse entered the public domain, and Disney couldn't stop it. But that was just the surface. Because while the world celebrated the freedom of one black and white cartoon, Disney had already completed something far more dangerous. They had turned the collective memory of an entire generation into a locked corporate asset. And the hidden cost of that isn't just your monthly subscription fee. It's the slow, deliberate death of the original idea in modern cinema. To understand how we got here, you have to understand what Disney actually became, because it isn't what the logo tells you it is. For most of its early history, Disney was genuinely risky. Snow White in 1937 was so ambitious that Hollywood insiders called it Disney's folly. They were certain it would bankrupt the studio. It didn't. It became the highest-grossing film of its time and proved that animation could move people as deeply as any live-action drama. That was a company willing to bet everything on something no one had seen before. Then, something shifted. Over roughly 2 decades, Disney stopped being a studio and became a system, a vertically integrated machine designed not to create, but to acquire and control. In 1996, they bought ABC for $19 billion, placing themselves directly inside millions of American living rooms. In 2006, Pixar, the most creatively alive animation studio in the world, was absorbed for $7.4 billion. Marvel followed in 2009 for $4 billion, delivering over 8,000 characters and a franchise engine that would dominate global cinema for 15 years. Lucasfilm and Star Wars came next in 2012 for another $4 billion, securing the most devoted fan base in modern mythology. And in 2019, the $71.3 billion acquisition of Fox, the second-largest media merger in history, reshaped the entire industry overnight. In 2 decades, Disney swallowed the biggest entertainment icons of the 20th century whole. And the scale of that consolidation was enough to suffocate competition entirely. When Disney closed Blue Sky Studios after the Fox deal, they didn't keep it running, they shut it down, laid off hundreds of artists, and silenced a studio that made genuinely different-looking films. That's not expansion, that's elimination. By 2019, Disney controlled nearly 40% of the US box office, a level of dominance no studio had ever reached in the modern era. And when one company controls that much of the market, it's no longer a market, it's a toll booth on every road in the country. So here's the uncomfortable question. Why do we keep paying? Why do we keep showing up for the 14th Marvel film or the live-action remake of something we already watched 30 years ago? The answer isn't stupidity, it's neuroscience. Disney bets everything on nostalgia, not the warm, accidental kind, but the engineered, calculated kind. When you hear the first notes of The Circle of Life, your brain doesn't just recognize a song, it physically returns you to the moment you first heard it. Maybe you were 7, maybe your mom was next to you, maybe the world felt safe. Psychologist Peter Janata found that musical memories from our formative years are among the most emotionally embedded we have. Disney didn't discover that by accident. They built an entire business model on top of it. The Lion King remake in 2019 is the perfect case study for this formula. Critics gave it a 53% on Rotten Tomatoes. Reviewers called it hollow, emotionally empty, technically impressive, but completely soulless. It made $1.6 billion. That number tells you everything about how the system works. A film that felt like a computer algorithm directed it, not a human, still generated over $1.5 billion. Because the audience wasn't buying a movie, they were buying a memory. And when a hollow remake makes that much money, the financial system sends a message to every creator on Earth. Don't be new, be comforting. That reward structure is what's killing original cinema. Now let's look at the parts of this story that Disney's PR team would rather you never think about. The copyright machine, first. The founding fathers intended copyright to last 14 years. The logic was simple. Give creators enough time to profit, then return the work to the public so culture can keep evolving. By the time Mickey Mouse was created in 1928, the limit had grown to 28 years. Under the original rules, that mouse should have entered the public domain by 1956. Instead, Disney lobbied Congress twice, in 1976 and again in 1998, pushing through what academics formally call the Copyright Term Extension Act and what everyone else calls the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. Today, corporate copyrights last 95 years from publication. Here's the part that should genuinely anger you. Disney built its entire empire on works from the public domain. Cinderella, Snow White, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Rapunzel. All of these came from fairy tales freely available to anyone, stories that belonged to humanity. Disney took them, added songs, softened the endings, and copyrighted their versions so aggressively that for most people alive today, Rapunzel isn't a Brothers Grimm story anymore, she's Tangled. They climbed the ladder of the public domain and then pulled it up behind them, blocking every artist who came after from doing the same thing they did. Second, the creative poverty that monopoly creates. When genuine competition exists, studios take risks. They have to, because if they put out something mediocre, someone else's better film takes the audience. But when one company controls 40% of the market and the major studios are all consolidating around them, risk becomes the enemy and originality becomes a liability. That's why we're drowning in sequels, prequels, reboots, and live-action remakes. It isn't laziness, it's math. Every sequel has a pre-installed audience. Every remake has a nostalgia multiplier. Every franchise extension is a risk-managed corporate asset, not a story someone burned to tell. The artists pay for that math with their voices. Ryan Coogler made Black Panther inside the machine. Taika Waititi brought his irreverent New Zealand sensibility to Thor Ragnarok and made the most alive Marvel film in years. But both of them were working inside a system that holds final cut, owns the IP, and decides what gets a sequel and what gets buried. Third, the silence that monopoly buys. Disney has a $9 billion stake in the Chinese market, and that number comes with conditions. No Disney film contains criticism of the Chinese government. ESPN has been caught using Beijing-approved framing in coverage of Southeast Asian politics. Entire story elements have been altered or removed to protect market access. When a creative company needs an authoritarian government's approval to function, the casualty is always the same thing, the truth. And fourth, the cost that gets the least attention. The mid-budget film is disappearing. Not the superhero blockbuster, not the animated franchise, the $20 million character drama, the weird experimental sci-fi, the quiet human story that doesn't need to make $1 billion to justify its existence.
Disney's financial dominance forces every other studio to chase the same blockbuster model, because nothing else can compete for screen space, marketing reach, or algorithmic visibility. If your film doesn't have a flying superhero or a recognizable IP attached to it, the system treats you like you don't exist. We are losing the stories that define what it actually feels like to be human, not because nobody wants to make them, but because the economics have been engineered against them. Everything Everywhere All at Once was made for $14 million, won 7 Academy Awards including Best Picture, and made $70 million at the box office. That same year, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, widely considered one of the worst Marvel films ever made $476 million. The audience did speak, the machine just wasn't listening. So what do we actually do about this? First, antitrust law needs to mean something again. The Paramount Consent Decrees of 1948 broke up the original Hollywood studio system when it got too consolidated. Studios were forced to separate production from distribution, and it worked. It created decades of competitive, diverse filmmaking. Those decrees were lifted in 2020, the same year Disney's streaming strategy went into overdrive. That timing is not a coincidence. What needs to happen structurally isn't complicated. One company should not be able to make the content, own the streaming platform, control the theaters, and set the terms for how everyone else accesses those screens simultaneously. Second, copyright reform is long overdue. A 95-year corporate copyright is not a limited time. For most human beings, it's a lifetime. Shortening corporate copyright terms even to 50 years would release an enormous cultural inheritance back into the commons. back to artists who can't afford licensing fees, back to storytellers who want to work with the same material Disney used to build its empire. And third, the part that's actually on us. We have to be willing to take a risk on something we haven't seen before. Sinners, past lives, everything everywhere, the wild robot. These films exist. They're getting made. But they need audiences who show up before the algorithm tells them to. Because here's the truth about algorithms. Disney's algorithm is designed to show you more Disney. If you only watch what you're recommended, you're not choosing anything. You're being chosen for. Every ticket you buy for an original film is a direct financial vote against the monopoly. Every recommendation you make to a friend keeps a piece of independent cinema alive. The system is powerful, but it runs entirely on passive consumption. When audiences become active, when we search for the weird title, leave the review, share the film nobody's heard of, the fortress shows cracks. Walt Disney himself once said, "It's kind of fun to do the impossible." There was a time when Disney was the underdog, a small studio with a mouse and a dream, making a bet nobody thought would pay off. What Disney became is, in many ways, the opposite of what it started as. The magic was never the mouse, it was the audacity to believe a new story was worth telling. That audacity is still out there. It's in the independent theaters, the film festivals, the short films, and the scripts sitting in someone's drawer that don't fit a franchise template. The question is whether we're paying attention to them, or whether we're too busy watching the same story again.